All right, well, let's get going. Welcome, everyone. This is the SCTG webinar series, and today we're going to be presenting on enhancing implementation of substance misuse mitigation strategies within a PBIS framework. I'm John Seeley. I'm a professor, and Associate Dean for Research within the College of Education. It's 8 o'clock on the West Coast, so we're still getting the cobwebs out, and I'll let my collaborator introduce himself. Sean.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean Austin, and I am a research associate here at the University of Oregon. Background for me is as a substance abuse counselor and then as a school psychologist before becoming a researcher. So got a pretty unique set. I was talking to my wife. I think I'm the only one that I know of that has had these steps of substance abuse counselor, 2 school psychologists, 2 researchers. So hopefully I'm uniquely positioned to talk on the topic.
All right. Thanks, Sean. And we have a full agenda today. Our learning objectives are to understand substance misuse trends and how the domains fit within a broader behavioral health context. We also want to identify strategies for bolstering supports for substance misuse within schools and learn about the integration of substance misuse prevention and mitigation strategies within the interconnected systems framework, which is a PBIS framework. And so we're going to start off with some trends. And as we go through, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We'll try to address those as we go along. And again, we do have a fairly full agenda, so we're going to have a pretty quick pace here. But we first want to start with the definition that the use of substances for a purpose that is not consistent with legal or medical guidelines. We're referring to that as substance misuse. And it differs from substance abuse because that's more of a DSM diagnostic category. And so we're talking about any use that is other than what is intended. And that includes the use of prescription drugs without a prescription or using them for other reasons than the condition for which they were prescribed. And it also includes using a higher quantity or frequency or for a longer duration than when they were prescribed. And so we're going to check with you about your knowledge of some of the trends in substances. We'll be presenting these trends from a couple decades. And so we'll be curious to hear about what you've noticed. And so the first substance we're going to talk about is alcohol. And so the question for you is, do you think the trend for binge drinking, which is the consumption of 5 or more drinks within a 2-hour period, is going up or down? And if you could just put what you think in the chat. We have up, down, down, down. And I think the downs have it. So let's look at that trend. Sure enough, across all grade levels, fortunately, we are seeing that binge drinking that's self-reported has been going down. And this is coming from the monitoring of the future questionnaire. And some of the data is based on the 2021 report, and other data that's been updated is based on the 2022 report. Okay, let's look at the next substance. How about illegal drug use? And this is an annual rate. Do you think that's going up or down? Well, it looks like the consensus is up, but it's tricky. It is tricky. Let's take a look at that. Well, it's kind of going up and down, but you'll notice that there's this big dip a couple of years ago, and that may have been one of the beneficial side effects of the pandemic, in that access to illicit drugs when everyone was at home and secluded, that probably impacted the availability and access to illegal drug use. And so this is illicit drug use overall. And so let's look at it when we take out cannabis, because we know that cannabis has been legalized and is more frequently available now in many of the states. So illicit drug use other than cannabis, do you think that's going up or down? Okay, some up, some down, up and down. All right, let's take a look at this. Well, when you take out cannabis, the trend is actually going down. And again, we still see that dip right around the period of the pandemic.
Yeah, on both of these, John, I'll just interject. But
Yeah.
It does seem like the pandemic has had a pretty strong influence on what's reported among youth for their use. So, yeah, that down arrow is really particularly, in 19, 20, 21, and even 22 here. So it's really interesting because it doesn't seem to track with, I think, a lot of what people have seen in schools and regionally, but yeah, it'll be one to continue to monitor, obviously, because it's unclear if that drop is permanent. But after a couple of years, it seems like it's sticking around there.
Yeah, and there's a question in the chat about the legalization, and that began, I would say, 8 years ago in some states, and then it has been steadily increasing in recent years. And so, but I think the first state to legalize recreational cannabis use was probably about 8 years ago. So let's take a look at the next substance, prescription opioids. Up or down? Yeah, for the prescription opioids, we think because of the opioid crisis that they've been going up, but actually because of change in prescribing laws, probably about 10 years ago, we started seeing this trend of access within the community for illegal use. It has been going down, and that's a fortunate thing. So we're seeing that these prescribing laws are actually taking a lot of these prescription drugs like OxyContin and Vicodin kind of out of the market and not available to the teens as much as they were about 10 years ago. How about cigarettes? Up or down? I think there's consensus that it's been going down. And that's a fortunate thing when we think about cigarette use for tobacco. And that has been a steady decline. And really, the percentage of use that's being reported these days is quite low. So that's very fortunate. Let's take a look at the next. What about vaping? And again, that's a more recent phenomena. And we have vaping for both tobacco, there's other substances in cannabis. And more recently, we've been hearing that there's some vaping of fentanyl, which is very dangerous. So the nicotine, you can see we're around 2016, that's when the data began collected. It really increased. There was a dip during the pandemic, but we're starting to see it maybe creeping up again. And I know that a lot of our school districts have identified vaping as a major concern within their schools for both nicotine and for marijuana or cannabis. How about students with substance possession referrals? So these are office discipline referrals. We're getting this data from the Swiss data set. And so, have substance possession referrals been going up or down?
I notice a trend when people are like really sure, and it's an easy one. Responses.
Right. And let's take a look at these the trends in these data. Again, this is only through 2019, so before the pandemic hit. But we do see kind of a steady increase, but there's a sharp increase overall, but that's mainly driven by tobacco. And I believe that the ODR for tobacco includes the vaping. And so it's really the recent trend in vaping since we've seen cigarette use go down. So that is on the rise. And so these, and this is possession or possessed on first referral, right, Sean? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
And unfortunately, so we see some downward trends in some of the illicit drug use. We see, some downward trends in alcohol and tobacco. But when we think about overdose deaths, they've been rapidly increasing. And this is really driven by synthetic opioids, including fentanyl. And so this is from the CDC, and it's all age groups combined. But if we look at a recent JAMA report, we see, and this is specifically for youth, and this is what's really disturbing, that the death rates have really increased since 2019. And again, that's the availability of illicit fentanyl on the streets, and we hear about that. I don't know if you listened to the State of the Union address, but President Biden brought up that topic last night as well. And so clearly, even though we see overall trends in substance use decreasing over the last couple of decades, the illicit fentanyl and overdose rates are very disturbing. And this has an impact, and we know this for the last 2 decades, that there's been an impact on schools. And students require substance misuse supports, and that's what we're going to be presenting on today across multi-tiered systems of support. For the students who report high risk opioid use, many of them started in middle school, reporting started in middle school. And we know that if they're at high risk for opioid use, they have a greater risk for heroin use late in high school. And we know that peers can really influence the use, and that's where peer refusal skills come into play. How do you say no, and how do you make sure that you don't get pressured into using? And students need help coping with traumatic home experiences. We know that children of family members who use opioids and other substances are at higher risk for a range of problematic outcomes, including high risk for developing opioid use themselves, and that's opioid use disorder. Higher likelihood of encountering traumatic experiences, and that often can lead to exposure to the child welfare system. And we know, too, that the families really need help coping. And these problems can be wide-ranging. They include situations like sudden loss of family member. We saw that death rate really increase, and that creates unique family structures, which can often involve shifting roles within the family and can cause additional stress and distress in addition to the loss. And then there's the context of the new guardians, such as grandparents. And they may be renewed novices in parenting children of a different generation than their own. And I know that for myself and my own kids. All right. Let's test your knowledge here. And we're going to lob up a few questions for you. And we want to know whether you think they're either true or false. Adolescence, is risk-taking unusual? That's either true or false. Yeah, that was a pretty easy one. We know it's false. It's actually quite normative for adolescents to be experimenting, and starting in middle school. How about early onset? Is that linked to dependence? And dependence, again, that is a diagnosis in the DSM. And so we're wondering, and that's where we refer to substance use disorders. And again, I think that one's a no-brainer, and is so true as well.
There we go. Sorry.
Okay. How about early intervention is important? Is that true or false? True. Yes.
Melanie's got some additional thoughts on that. That's great.
Yeah. And last but not least, substance use disorders are rarely comorbid with mental health problems. And comorbid means co-occurring, that they may co-occur with depression, anxiety. Do we think that's true or false, that they are rarely comorbid? And those negatives always trick me up.
Sorry, no one's keeping score.
Yeah. And again, that's false. We know it's highly comorbid. Usually about 2/3 of those with substance use disorders have a co-occurring mental health problem. So we're now going to shift gears and try to figure out how to solve this.
Thank you, John. So yeah, John has given us a nice background context. I think some facts to help situate what approaches would work and what won't. And so to start off the section on recommendations, I like to have this slide that situates, a side of like there's a foundational set of things that need to be in place within schools, and there's also like these specific points of engagement, practices. And so the foundation piece we're not going to talk as much about today, specifically looking at how much, time, FTE, funding, specific policies that are in place. Let's touch a little bit on that. We're not going to talk a ton about like the aspects of a preventative framework that you need to have implemented in your schools to support that work. We'll touch on it and kind of advocate for ISF as kind of being a house for that. But we're going to spend more time on the points of engagement, specifically looking at how we can engage students, families, and staff to successfully prevent and mitigate substance misuse. And so the first and perhaps most obvious start for that is employing substance misuse expertise within your schools. This is something that is pretty uncommon at this stage. I think some more metropolitan sites might have an ability to hire, recruit behavioral health practitioners, specifically substance misuse, like certified staff into their schools. Oftentimes that's going to be almost solely for counseling, but here we're advocating for also consulting with them on additional practices outside of that, right? Practices that might be tier 1 or tier 2 practices, as opposed to just that tier 3 working with individual students. It's not that work isn't important too, but having a substance misuse expert lens on the whole system, I think, is what we're hoping to deliver a more comprehensive suite of services for our students that can be overall more preventative on this topic. And there is an example from the field that I just want to plug here. Portland Public Schools overall has been pretty progressive around this. A few years ago, they started investing more heavily in substance misuse prevention in their district. And so they hired 4 full-time certified staff, that's certified alcohol and drug counseling staff within the district, so directly hired. And the services they provide included that individual student counseling, but they also did consultation with families. They engaged in outreach, and they also supported students who were returning from treatment or from, say, suspension or expulsion due to related issues. Melanie, I see you have a question about getting a copy of the PowerPoint. I don't have a direct answer to that. John, do you know?
Yeah, I believe we can make that available. So
okay, yeah, so we can push that through. Thank you for the question.
And we should also note too, with all the federal funding that's now going to be available for mental and behavioral health coming to the states and the districts, this will be an opportunity to actually follow the Portland Public Schools lead and actually employ the certified alcohol and drug counselors. So hopefully we'll see some of this trend increase too of placing these experts within the districts.
Yeah, there's some upsides to having this national attention on this issue is that ultimately more funding is going to get pushed. And yeah, thanks for mentioning that, John. So school staff can be on the lookout for those sources. Beyond that, next talking about social emotional learning as being a recommendation. And social emotional learning, most people are probably familiar with and maybe encouraged, because this is something that's becoming more and more common, especially as like a tier one kind of universal instructional support. Social emotional learning is becoming more and more widespread, and it's focuses on increasing students' abilities to self-manage, to self-calm, to set goals, to use positive coping skills. And so that is all from the research telling us this is going to be a preventative mechanism for substance misuse later, because a lot of the reasons for use, difficulty self-managing, difficulty having long-term goals that are kind of serve as that anchor, and inability to cope with difficult circumstances. And it's not to say that we can prepare students for everything, but this is a really positive step that we can take early on. This isn't just like middle school, high school. This is something that we can build on even in elementary ages. And often, again, schools do. So if you're already doing this work, you can kind of give yourself a pat on the back and say, we are doing things that do support students around this issue, even if it's more upstream. So on the prevention side, I talked about the universal curriculum, but embedding social emotional learning into school-wide expectations for PBIS schools is also a really good consideration, right? You're making that part of the ingrained culture of the school. This is how we manage conflict. This is how we manage ourselves. And I'll give some examples of that later. On the mitigation side, of course, having counseling services where you can have more supported work around some of these skills, that's great. And then even having monitoring in place to determine whether or not students are making progress. All of that is going to be helpful in this trajectory of reducing substance misuse.
And throughout
sorry, go ahead, John.
I was going to just say, throughout the slide deck, we've embedded some links to these resources, and I assume you were just going to say that, Sean. So sorry about that.
I was. That's great. Let's make sure that we don't miss it. There are resources from the PBIS Center that are helpful. I'm not sure if we have our own brief in here, now that I think about it, but we might have to send that along separately.
Okay. And Brandy has a question. Are there any recommendations for school-wide SEL curriculums that work across grade levels, K-8 and 9 through 12?
Brandy, I don't have any specific recommendations offhand. I'm going to go with like the broader recommendation of SEL at this point, because we don't get into really endorsing specific ones. But I know of examples out there that do most of this K-8. I think second step is going to be one, strong kids and then strong teens. Those are quality curriculum that I'm aware of, but I haven't recently looked at their scope for K through 12. But I believe strong kids and strong teens is probably going to get closest to that. Do you have other suggestions?
Yeah, there's also sources of strength. And that started as a middle high school, but now they have an elementary version as well. And so that's another SEL program. And that's really targeted at all kind of impacts of behavioral health. And it was specifically designed for suicide prevention. But it's now with the downward adaptation, it's more general.
And so again, those aren't necessarily going to have the school or the peer refusal skills embedded into them, but they are going to touch on many of those skills that are relevant for prevention here. All right, and then this I will try to not get on the soapbox too tall, but this is a particular area of interest for me, and looking at how schools use exclusionary discipline. It's often used for cases where students have brought substances onto campus. It's alcohol, tobacco, other substances, drugs. And John and I did some research on that, and it's a paper that's pending, but we found that 90+% of students possessing alcohol or drugs on campus are suspended on the first offense. And so they're suspended out of school, most commonly, but also in school. And then expulsion is the most extreme end of those. But 90+% for alcohol and drugs. And that's going to it's going to make it problematic to support students that we know are having, clearly are at risk for developing substance use disorders and might have other things going on in their lives. So thinking about the consequence of exclusionary discipline beyond, we're removing a substance from our setting is really important when you're a school administrator, school staff that has some influence on those decisions. Because we know it's harmful long-term, right? We know it reduces engagement in school, reduces connectedness to school for those students. It reduces their likelihood to graduate, and it even increases likelihood of incarceration and engagement with crime later on. So that's the soapbox of what we know about exclusionary discipline and why that doesn't work most cases, and really doesn't work here, just because we're sending students out with less supervision than they would have otherwise had, and they probably need the most. On the prevention side, as an alternative, increasing supervision, instruction, and the part that I'd like to focus on most is having relationships with students. This is an area of research that I've dug into a little bit more recently, and this idea of school connectedness, whether or not students have an important staff member or adult that they can rely on that's within the school, that it has a real effect on trajectory, right? Whether or not they come to school, their attendance, and again, graduation rates. On the mitigation side of things, of course, we have to deal with mistakes when students make them. So I'm not just saying don't exclude. I mean, there are other things that you can do to process this mistake that the student has made. And engaging in restorative approaches, restorative circles, restorative conferences, where you talk about the harm that's been done and like action steps to try and repair harm that's happened between, the trust between adults and students and their peers. Engaging them in counseling within the building, and even referring for support if appropriate, right? Schools aren't always going to provide every support students need. And so if you have, treatment resources that you're connected within your community, making that warm handoff there is another great alternative.
And with the increases that we've seen with the office discipline referrals for vaping, this is really important. How can we do alternatives to exclusionary discipline for those that do get caught vaping on campus?
And an example from Portland Public Schools on this that I like to rely on here, because again, it's pretty progressive, and it's one that I don't know if many people have had exposure to, but this idea of a policy that mandates that no exclusion happens for substance possession on first violations. That's what's taking place in Portland. There's just no exclusion for first violations. There is an exception to that if the student is distributing, but overall, this is probably the most protective of students in terms of policies that I've come across so far. As a part of that process, it's not just no exclusion. The administrator meets with the student and the family together. The student is required to engage in what's effectively some social emotional learning instruction, right? Psychosocial instruction. It's kind of it's a program that aims to give students another perspective on substance use and the risks, and alternatives for how they can cope with stressors in life and that kind of thing, and putting them in touch with resources. And another aspect of that is increasing supervision. Sometimes these students are searched as a part of, that there's been breached trust. And so that when they come back, it becomes routine to search them for a period of time to make sure that, everyone's holding up their end of the bargain and staying safe. So there's a link to that on this slide. And as we said earlier, we'll make sure that these slides get to you.
And this is a clear deviation from the zero tolerance policies that some districts still have in place.
Yes. And surprisingly, that is still very common. So I imagine some participants might be aware of that in their own or local districts. Zero tolerance is still remarkably popular for how remarkably debunked it is as a successful deterrent for or a successful intervention for discipline issues. So I would say one of the most clear aspects in the research for us as we were digging into this years ago is the influence of that family members and parents can have on like protecting their students against some of these risks associated with substance misuse. And so the recommendations that we have being within the boundaries of school are to engage proactively with families to design responsive programs, to design responsive systems. They're kind of an ear to the ground, but also a perspective that is often lost when school teams are making decisions in isolation. And so, part of it's pulling them into meetings to get a sense of what they're seeing from their students, what they're concerned about, what information they don't have that they feel like they need in order to support their students better. And understand that there's a wide spectrum, right? Like when we design, communication that goes out to parents, we try and make it so that it is understandable by all, right? Like we want the most, we want that to be communicated well to everyone. And so you think about that in terms of prevention and treatment for substance misuse. It boils down to awareness of risks and awareness of services that are available for these families. I've got a few examples on the next slide, but I just want to plug that there's a whole family engagement. It's almost an ebook, I would say, on the PBIS website that you can check out there through the link. But some specific examples of family engagement that I'd like to call out at this point. Newsletters, a very efficient means of transmitting information to parents, especially electronic ones where, it goes to their email. That's a very common thing I have from my own children's schools. We get, emails with updates. And this is something that you can use to your benefit to provide information related to drug risk and drug misuse mitigation. Specifically, practices that might be folded into this family engagement would be drug disposal programs. And this might not be familiar to everyone, but what this is a program where the school hosts or directs parents to sites where they can dispose of unused or expired medications. This is a surprisingly common avenue for students starting, their substance misuse journey, I guess, is untended medications that have just been sitting around in the drawer. So for any medications that are not immediately or expected to be used, having a safe site to dispose of those a lot of parents aren't aware that this is a risk, and B, aware that there's something that somewhere they can safely dispose of those. So sponsoring or coordinating with like a local pharmacy is a great way to immediately reduce risk because you're taking those drugs out of the household.
And restricting access within the household too. And so if, there is a need to have these prescription opioids, for treating a problem within family members, how do you restrict that access so it's not readily available to the teens?
Yeah, and then to follow that, the aspect of monitoring, and that monitoring I think covers a few different things, but just making sure that the caregivers and parents are aware of where their students are, during the day after school, but also monitoring. It's not terribly uncommon for students to be prescribed opioid medications for sports injuries, other injuries. This is something that I think has been reduced gradually over time, but these prescriptions are still being written, and of course, there's some need. There are instances where students are in pain and need to be treated for that. But monitoring that student's use closely of those medications is going to be really important, especially for, frequency, not using more than is prescribed, not using for a longer duration than prescribed, because that only increases risk. The last prevention aspect that I'll touch on here is encouraging extracurricular activities. And this is really just, it goes along the lines of that limiting access, right? If you're engaged in another activity, you can't also be doing engaging with substances. So I would say there might be some exceptions with lesser supervised activities, but when you think about extracurricular activities at schools or volunteering in the community, those are times that you might be taking away that could be, unstructured, otherwise risky venues. On the mitigation side, coordinating and communicating around available tier 2 and tier 3 services. It's not just making sure that parents are aware, but also engaging them and maybe using them as partners in tier 2 or tier 3 instruction, reinforcing skills, even just following up with their students at the end of the day. Tell me something that you learned within the scope, or, hey, I know that you worked on this skill. Can you show me what that looks like? Just following up and making that those skills more generalized. When we're talking about, in particular, social emotional skills, self-calming routines, coping skills, those are all going to be supportive. So if we can engage parents in that, just giving additional opportunities for practice is really, that's a great place to start. Also making parents aware of referral resources. So giving, it's not just handing a pamphlet out, but that is not the worst place to start. Making sure that parents are aware of resources within the community or within the school for, substance use treatment or screening services. And then the last one, and this is one that John and I have seen become more prominent since we started talking about it, is this idea of having a liaison to community providers, having a family liaison that supports, kind of this triage of connecting parents directly with the service providers that are most appropriate for their needs. And that can be a very broad spectrum of possible needs, but it should include substance misuse services. There's also shelter services that you might engage with, food security, mental health providers more generally. But that's a great investment in resources. And that could be something that, you lean into with maybe new windfalls related to some of these state level and federal initiatives. Anything to add there, John?
Well, and I also want to mention that with the litigation on the OxyContin and the funding that's going to come down from that litigation to states, that's starting to be released now. And I'm hoping that the states will leverage that funding to help with community care specialists being embedded in school districts to help in this regard.
Yes. Yeah. To that note, I was having a conversation with someone at the University of Nevada, Reno, and they were talking about basically this new pot of money that they had to implement school-based prevention and mitigation efforts related to substance misuse. So yeah, it is nice to have those resources come in and having more to work with within our schools. On the professional development side, we obviously need to prepare our teachers and educators for what they can do, to support students and their overall behavioral health and wellness. I think a fundamental part of that is, still good classroom practices, good school-wide practices, positive behavior support. And so we're not going to talk too much about that, but understanding that like having that foundational solid practice that engages students and makes them feel safe and welcome, very important. Beyond that, though, understanding what the referral process is for students when they have concerns about a student's mental behavioral health broadly, like who do they go to and how do they get that information to a person that can help? That is something that you can make really clearly defined in a procedure. You go to so-and-so within a building, like your counselor, your administrator. Some have actual online forms to submit where it goes then to a team that reviews these referrals on a weekly basis. And then manages the handoff through, say, a family liaison or another school personnel who's designated. Next, beyond that, is having a procedure for managing incidents, and that goes to this discipline side as well as kind of these emergency incidents side. But having these procedures written out goes a long way. But beyond that, making sure that staff are trained on it, right? Making sure that people are aware of the procedures is the next step. And oftentimes we get lost in that, and it's hard to at the beginning of the school year training could be like a month long, sometimes with all the expectations that we have on teachers, but trying to figure out a way to get that into their hands and get that knowledge readily accessible in the event that an incident does occur is really important. And then lastly, for professional development, schools can benefit from engaging in these community academic partnerships, working with institutions of higher education, such as universities, participating in research projects to collaboratively and creatively program based on the school's needs. More and more universities, I think, are trying to engage in this more collaborative model, using and relying on the expertise of the local knowledge of what students need, what parents need, what staff are responsive to develop interventions and approaches that truly are effective, and then can be demonstrated elsewhere, disseminated elsewhere. So look for those opportunities, and I would say don't shy away if someone reaches out to you.
Yeah, and that technical assistance and coaching can really help with sustainment of the effective practices, to have those experts readily available to provide the professional development training.
And just a quick example here of referral links that are distributed through Portland Public Schools. Like I said, I lean on them, but they're doing a lot of good things. They have these referral links that are pushed out to their staff, but it's also a public-facing website. And so these referrals can be sent by parents, sent by students. Students can self-refer through these forums if they wanted to. So thinking of how broadly you want these things to be accessible, and sharing those in a way that like this goes out through the newsletter every month, I think, through Portland. So yeah, it's just, you can be creative and you can try and get cast this broad net to make sure that any students that need help are getting it. And last of our recommendations here is the emergency protocol. And this is one of those topics that I think is hard to plan for. It's maybe a difficult thing to imagine in some schools, and some schools are dealing with this, not infrequently, and therefore they're already engaged. But planning for an overdose on campus, I think, is one of the lowest cost and highest reward possibilities of like everything that we've mentioned here. It's specifically and probably more like in secondary schools, middle school, high school, having staff that are trained to identify signs of overdose, having a procedure for first responder notification, and having opioid antagonists on site. These are medications that can be administered in case of overdose for specifically opioids. So the drugs that we talked about, the synthetic being fentanyl, OxyContin, Vicodin, all of these various opioids. Antagonists can reverse the effects of those. And so it's a relatively cheap, I think most cases you can get them for free locally from like emergency responder sites. So like I think fire departments often will have them, police stations too, pharmacies maybe even as well. John, do you have a comment there?
And they're much easier to administer these days too. Some come in spray, other kind of like an EpiPen. And so, it takes minimal training to be able to access and administer these antagonists.
Yes. And for those that might be a little wary of what that looks like, there's a link at SAMHSA, and it says store.samhsa, but I don't think it's the actual store. It's just a nice document that shows you essential steps for first responders and kind of gives you an idea of what that protocol can be. So with that, those are the recommendations, the core recommendations for like practices, points of engagement. Now we're going to move into the ISF and talking about how systems can support these practices being implemented really well and across tiers and kind of comprehensively. Of course, responding with systems is going to be the most efficient way to approach most issues, especially the ones that are pervasive and persistent. Allows for some flexibility and obviously the strength of teams. So if you're familiar with PBIS, and I think many of you probably are, you can think of the interconnected systems framework as the single system of delivery for mental health support. We're integrating school-based mental health into PBIS. So that famous triangle that we have where we got universal and then targeted and then intensive supports, we're pushing school-based mental health into that. And mental health is more the phrase that we use in ISF, but John and I are doing our best to infuse behavioral health as being the phrase, because substance misuse is often excluded from this mental health discussion, even though we know it's highly comorbid. We know that it's often related to mental health issues already. Let's just broaden the umbrella that we're speaking about and call it behavioral health.
Yeah, ideally, we break down these silos that have been typically there around mental health, substance abuse, and even suicide prevention. How do we take an integrated approach rather than treating them in separate silos?
Indeed, and there are a lot of advantages to the ISF model, right? This pushing of behavioral health into the PBIS framework. We've got better alignment then and continuum of services. We've got better coordination and understanding among staff about what services are provided and what's available. And then improved access for students and retention of them in care, in services that are vital for them to thrive. And so I want to walk through a little bit, illustrate and maybe sell you on this idea of integrating in an ISF. And the first piece is talking about how we can align practices. And on the basic level, we know that, tier one universal expectations are things that can be embedded into tier two small group interventions. If you spend more time reteaching and reinforcing those behaviors that we're trying to see more of. And then the tier three, the intensive support, we're doing that, to a more extensive degree. When we see that worked out, these in a PBIS framework, this idea of we are responsible, we can embed a social emotional learning target of, I'm going to listen to my body signals. I'm going to use my calming routine. So there are more examples of that, I think, within the SEL PBIS Center brief. So if you have that link, please use it. But this is kind of a walkthrough of it. And on the universal level, we have curriculum that will review, this feeling, thought, action cycle. That's all in tier one. On tier two, we can use that same language, but still intensify the instruction. We know there are going to be students that don't need just one lesson every couple of weeks, but rather are going to need, regular lessons throughout the week to practice identifying their signals, to use their calming routines, and be maybe more actively and thoroughly coached through using them and communicating what strategies they're using with their teachers. And of course, at tier three, there are going to be students that still, tier two and tier one are insufficient. And so as we identify what their needs are, get them into tier three intervention, they're going to need daily instruction, but you can still use the same language across. And when you think about the strength of similar language across tiers, if you have a student that's receiving tier three services, working on identifying unique triggers for them, really having these individualized calming routines, you can still refer to tier one language. And those tier one teacher, the general classroom teachers are going to be able to use cues that student can rely on and actually successfully cue their use of the same skills that they just need more support with. So this idea of alignment of, an SEL goal or SEL focus is going to, I think, pay dividends pretty well for these students that are struggling, to a greater degree. The next piece that I want to talk about is enhancing, substance misuse services mitigation prevention through access. In a typical multi-tiered model, we've got, access in tier 1, all students get those services. In tier 2, there's a screening. We have then a funnel into school-based services, and then, caregivers are engaged to reinforce those skills at home. Tier 3, we've got a similar process, but maybe with referral to partners in the community, and of course, more intensive supports and maybe more active engagement of caregivers. The really important piece of these that we should lean on for the services that we're talking about with substance misuse is the screening aspect. And I'll show you why. In a recent study that was done of systematic screening for social, emotional, behavioral needs, it was found, a school could identify, by, teacher nomination and more, I would say more traditional, probably not, entirely data-based or only partially data-based, not using a specific screener. They identified 10% of students that would be identified for services. Using an actual screener to, look through, interview every student or complete a survey for each student around a number of items that indicate social, emotional, behavioral health. They identified an additional almost 20% of students that needed some help. So these are going to be those students that are not on your radar, but still indicated as at risk and probably needing some support to stay on the right trajectory. And so thinking about that with substance misuse, if we just by using a screener can identify a lot more of those students who are at risk, why not? And having a system in place to do that, at tier 1 and tier 2, having multiple risk levels where we can allocate, to the appropriate services, it could make a substantial difference and dent in the substance misuse issue that we're talking about. And so an example of that I'll just briefly talk to is, and we have a brief that is coming out soon, but this idea of screening, brief intervention, and referral to treatment. You're going to see that in the middle there, the expert/craft screening. It is a very, it's coming into vogue, I think, is something that's being implemented in more school-based settings by school-based staff. This idea that we can screen students, and then for those that are at low risk or kind of intermediate risk, do this brief intervention, this motivational kind of interviewing, talking about the risk and trying to motivate them to not engage in risky behavior, i.e. substance use. But for those that are at that high risk, doing a brief intervention and trying to use that brief intervention, motivational interviewing, to refer to treatment, to encourage them to actually follow through with the referral to treatment. It's a research-based approach that has, in the early research that's been done, really positive effects for making sure that students are getting the appropriate level of care. And even that brief intervention for the students that, are at low risk seems to have a better effect. So I encourage you to dig in a little bit more to that. And like I said, there should be a brief out soon. We authored it a while ago. It's just there's a pipeline and we have to adhere to their timeline. Enhancing the ISF is also going to enhance retention and care. And that's comes down to a couple really basic things, I think. But when you have services that are available in schools related to substance misuse, whether it's counseling, tier 3 instruction, social emotional instruction, the access is going to be improved due to two primary things. I think cost, right? Most services that schools provide are paid for through tax dollars and therefore not an additional cost. And also logistics. It does not require additional effort, time, expense to transport, to get students engaged in the services. And so those two things alone are, I think, driving much of that, better retention. Research says that students are better engaged in care if it's accessed through school. But it also allows the schools to monitor and have a little bit more information on what the student is doing, right? You've got instantly, whether or not they're attending, their counseling services, Whether or not they're making progress, especially if it's someone that's employed within the district and they're folded into an MTSS team. And then you can even implement fidelity of that. You can monitor implementation fidelity of those services. So a lot of strengths to this idea of having this in-house. And the last is enhancing through coordination, which is basically just saying that, having these services in school, just got a call. Having these services in school allows, or having these resources within the school, having these school personnel that are connected with community providers allows for that better connection to be bridged between schools and providers, between families and providers, and overall is going to enhance the cohesiveness of that approach. And so we have, with just a few minutes left here, a few programming ideas for you all to stick to, to reference. And of course, these slides are going to be available so you can review them in a little bit more detail. Before I get into those, I just want to acknowledge that there are some challenges with these. First of all, being that contextual fit is absolutely a necessity to evaluate, right? What's going to be the best for your situation, your population of students, your staff, and their current training and knowledge level. It's also really important to think about the equitable access to services, making sure that it's available in the languages and in a way that's culturally appropriate for the students that you're concerned about within your schools. So just a little plug there, something to evaluate overall as you're considering these programs and practices. First, we have Tier 1 programs and practices. Operation Prevention is a great school-based curriculum. It's pretty basic and ready to implement kind of out of the box. And it's something worth exploring if you're just thinking, I want to do something, in the next month. This would be something that does not take a lot of training, has parent toolkits, has classroom lessons and resources, a great starting point. In addition, there's BOTFIN life skills and some strengthening families programs, the strengthening families program that tend to be a little bit more involved and require more training from my understanding of it. And I'll skip down to the SAMHSA resource guides, which if you just Google that, you'll be able to find a whole host of guides related to, lessons, but also kind of awareness information, just general information on substances. Lots of resources there. John, do you have anything to add here?
No, but the slides will cover tiers 2 and 3, and I know that we're out of time, so you'll be able to take a look at that. And the link is in the chat, and they are readily available. And please, I think you have your contact information in there, Sean, too, at the end.
I do, right here.
Okay.
Yeah, so feel free to reach out if you have any questions or want to connect on additional resources. We've been connecting with a few lately. So thank you for your time today. Sorry, ran a little short. That was my fault.
Well, thanks, Sean. Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.